meeting will be starting right at 12 o'clock, so in about 5 minutes. Please mute your phone if you haven't already, or mute your computer. Thanks. Thank you to everyone who's joining. We'll be starting here in just about 2 minutes. Please remember to mute your phones if you haven't already.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this beautifully snowy Friday. My name is Colin Walker. I'm the Legislative Director for Colorado SHRM, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Edie Sonn, the Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs for Pinnacol Assurance. Edie's going to speak to us about a very creative and interesting idea as an alternative to the paid family and medical leave program that the Colorado legislature has been considering and trying to pass. But let me tell you a little bit about Edie. Edie oversees Pinnacol's internal and external communications, government relations, and community relations functions. She joined the company in 2014, bringing over 20 years of experience in health policy and public affairs. Before coming to Pinnacle, she was the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Center for Improving Value in Healthcare. Previously, Edie served as the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the Colorado Medical Society, where she oversaw government affairs at both the state and federal levels and led numerous health policy initiatives. Before joining CMS, Edie was Public Affairs and Public Relations Consultant. Edie holds a master's degree in public policy from Duke University and a Bachelor of Arts from the Becher School from the Colorado College. Let me say also that I met Edie several years ago when I became the legislative director for Colorado SHRM and really didn't know what I was doing. Edie definitely knows what she was doing and has really been helpful to me and very generous with her time, which has helped me do a better job for all of you. So we've all benefited enormously from Edie's time and knowledge, and she's been very generous to us. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Edie. Edie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that very kind introduction. And may I say it has been my great pleasure to be able to work with you over these recent years. So what I'd like to do today is start by giving you some background, just level all of us up on the context of this issue over the last few years, talk a little bit about why Pinnacle has become involved and what we proposed, and then bring you up to speed on where things are, because it's a very different place. And I'm sure many, if not most of you, have read some of the recent media coverage about what's happening on this issue now. And before I begin that, let me also note, Sarah very kindly shared with you a fact sheet about our proposal, and you can pretty much just disregard that, because at this point some of the specifics about that proposal are a bit of a moot point, and that will become more clear when I talk to you later about where things are now. So Sarah, if you could advance to the next slide, please. So first of all, just to remind everybody where we've come from, as I'm sure you're well aware that over the last 7 legislative sessions, there have been 6 attempts to establish a state-run paid family and medical leave program. And of course, they never went anywhere, because up until last year, we had split control in the legislature, with the Democrats controlling the House, the Republicans controlling the Senate. The bill was always introduced in the House with the certainty that it would die in the Senate. And even so, the fights around it centered less, I would say, on the structure and whether it should even exist. Certainly those fights are really mostly about what the benefit package would be. And the business community has consistently said, please, we do not need, we cannot afford a state-run plan. Let the market handle it. So then
Edie, hold on, we lost you for a second. Edie, can you speak again, because we lost you for a second?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. So last year, everybody, all the Democrats thought that the wind was in their sails and they would be able to get this bill passed because they controlled both chambers and the governor's office. But indeed, that did not happen, because the business community made a very clear point that the advocates were talking about establishing the very richest program of its kind in the country, and it simply wasn't feasible. People said, advocates said, we don't have Tabor implications here. The business community said, yes, you do. We can certainly mount a Tabor challenge about whether or not this is allowable under Tabor, or if indeed it's a tax increase that must be voted on. And ultimately, a handful of moderate Democrats in the Senate said, look, this is just going too far. We're not convinced this is the right way to go. And we're very concerned about how rich the benefit package is. So ultimately, last year's bill was amended to establish a task force to study the issue of paid family and medical leave and make recommendations to the legislature about what that should look like. Sarah, if you could advance to the next slide now. So that task force was very heavily weighted toward the advocates of a state-run plan. There were quote unquote business seats on the task force, but I would say 3 of the 5 went to what we would consider to be the mainstream business community. And then the other 2 went to folks who were more representative of the advocacy point of view. About setting up a state-run plan. Can you go to the next slide? Not sure if anybody else can hear me.
Can now, but it keeps cutting in and out.
Yeah, just
really?
Out. Sorry about that, but yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but Sarah, why don't I get off of the computer audio and I'll call in from my phone? I'll call in from my phone, okay?
Should we be hearing something? I don't hear anything. Sorry about that. I'm sorry, this is Edie. It seemed like I was having some problems with my computer audio. So I went ahead and closed out of the meeting and am now calling in from my phone. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, Edie, you sound good. Thank you for that.
Okay, great. And I apologize very much. Not quite sure what happened with that connection. So let me double check what slide we are on right now. Since I'm calling in, I don't have it up on my computer. Sarah, can you tell me we're on the slide?
The family
Perfect,
task
about the task force? Okay, yeah. Great. So the family task force then met. Let's make sure I'm completely muted. Okay, great. The family task force met over the summer and the fall. And although they were nominally supposed to be looking at a variety of ways to provide this benefit in Colorado, it was pretty much an exercise in foregone conclusions that they were going to endorse what they called a social insurance model, meaning a state-run plan. And indeed, when they delivered their recommendations to the legislature at the beginning of January, that's what they had in there. I'll just highlight a few other things that the task force recommended. Interestingly, they moved away from last year's bill. It would have had the premium split between the employer and the employee, and they said that it should be paid entirely by the employee. Now, I think that decision came from a couple of places. One being an economist on the task force who said, look, it doesn't matter if you say that the employer is going to pay all or some of it. Ultimately, that employer portion is going to be passed along to the employee anyway, so we might as well just cut to the chase. And also, I believe task force members knew that the employer share of the premium was a big sticking point for the business community last year, and thought that they might be able to mitigate business opposition to a state-run plan if they went in this direction. Then what else they did with their recommendations was they came up with a low benefit plan and a high benefit plan. In the low benefit plan, there were 6 weeks of family leave and 6 weeks of medical leave. In the high benefit plan, there were 14 weeks for each leave type. You can see some of the other components on this slide. I won't go through them in detail. The question about job protection, which of course was a big concern for all of you, I know, was not an issue on which the task force reached unanimous agreement. They had a number of views about job protections, but everyone on the task force, even the business representatives, believed that jobs should be held open after some period of time, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then their approach to wage replacement was that people with lower wage jobs would get a higher wage replacement rate, and vice versa. You make more money, you get less of your wages replaced. They hired an actuary to estimate how much this would cost, and he came in at $7 for $1,000 of wages at the low benefit plan and $11 for $1,000 of wages for the high benefit plan. Now, what's important to understand about that actuarial analysis, my actuarial analysis, and anyone that you'll see from anybody else, is that we all are making a lot of assumptions, but critically, the analysis of the task force plan did not reflect startup costs to the state, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars, nor did it reflect ongoing administrative costs on an annual basis. So a lot of things were left out of that analysis, meaning that we believe that estimate is low. Sarah, could you advance to the next slide? So why did Pinnacol even get involved in this? Because you guys know us as the state's largest workers' comp carrier. So, and that's all we do. So why are we talking about paid family medical leave and inserting ourselves in these policy discussions? Well, for a number of years, the idea has been floated that Pinnacol could act as the third-party administrator for a self-funded plan. And that idea really came to the fore last year. And we reiterated what we've said every time that idea came up. Thank you very much for your confidence in us, but no thank you. First of all, we don't believe a state-run plan is the right way to go. Second of all, acting as a third-party administrator is not what Pinnacol does. And as we were aligning with our policyholders in the business community last year to say, you need a market-based approach on this, a number of folks in the business community said, can you help figure this out? And simultaneously, we were thinking we might be able to help figure this out. And that third bullet there about this being enlightened self-interest for Pinnacol, I want to be very upfront about this. You may or may not know that Pinnacol is restricted by statute to providing only workers' compensation and doing so only in Colorado. And we've been trying to loosen those statutory constraints for quite a while with no success. And it seems to us that if we were able to help figure out a private market for this particular product, it might be a way for us to do something else and broaden our own business portfolio. So I don't want to be coy about that. So we spent a number of months working with Aon Endpoint Consulting. Many of you probably know Aon Insurance. We looked at state-paid family medical leave programs elsewhere in the country. We talked to national life and disability carriers, and we came up with a proposal that we gave to the task force in the fall. And Sarah, if you go to the next slide, then I'll give an overview of what we came up with. So it starts with an employer mandate, similar to workers' comp, that employers would be required to provide the benefit, with a couple of key exceptions. Small businesses would be exempted. At this point, we're thinking that probably businesses with 20 employees and fewer. I realize that is a much lower threshold than in the federal FMLA, which is 50 employees and fewer, but that's the lion's share of businesses in Colorado, and there wouldn't be a viable insurance market if you told 85% they didn't have to participate. Then a couple of other key considerations are that companies that already offer this benefit could continue to offer what they're doing right now, as long as what they offer is at least as good as the state-mandated core. And then companies could either purchase an insurance product, self-insure, or again, do through their existing PTO and disability programs, as I'm sure many of you do. I know that's the way Pinnacol handles it right now. So we borrowed the notion of a mandate from workers' comp. We borrowed the core and buy-up approach from short-term disability. And you all are probably far more familiar with this than I am. But a core benefit would be set in statute. Obviously in disability, it's not set by law, but in this case, the core benefit would be set in statute, a minimum number of weeks, definitions of family members, allowable uses of the leave, and then employers and employees could purchase additional coverage if they wish. The one caveat we had about that is that we wouldn't recommend that employees be allowed to purchase additional weeks of leave unless the employer agreed to that, because obviously you need stability about when your workforce is going to be there and when they're going to be gone. This fourth bullet here about risk rating is very key, the most contentious piece of our proposal. You're probably all familiar with the notion of community rating versus risk rating, but at the risk of telling you things you already know, community rating is when everybody pays the same amount. That's the way health insurance is priced on the individual market since the Affordable Care Act. Risk rating is when you price your product based on the risk profile of the people buying it. And for paid family and medical leave, just as with short-term disability, the risk is based on demographic factors, age and gender. It is unfortunately a fact that women of childbearing age are going to be more likely to use the benefit. And frankly, middle-aged men are going to be more likely to use the medical leave portion for general disability purposes. So as an insurer trying to establish a viable insurance market, we said we have to be able to account for that risk. Now, there were a lot of concerns about employers discriminating in their hiring against people who they thought might contribute to a higher premium for them. We did not believe that that would be the case. A, it's already against the law. B, you don't see that with disability right now. Employers don't discriminate in their hiring because they're afraid it's going to raise their disability premiums. But we said, well, we can rate this at the level of 13 broad industry sectors. So rather than giving Collins Law Firm a price based solely on the demographic makeup of his law firm, his firm would be lumped into the broad professional services category. Rather than pricing a preschool on the risk profile of the teachers and administrators at that preschool, their premium would be based on the broad demographic profile of the education sector in general. So that was our view. We envisioned this being a competitive market. As I said, we had talked to a number of life and disability carriers nationally who said they'd be interested in participating. So we expected that we would participate in this as both a competitor and as the carrier of last resort, as we do in workers' comp, meaning we take all comers. As a carrier, we were agnostic about the benefits. How many weeks of leave should it be? What are the allowable uses of leave? We can administer, other carriers can administer pretty much any benefit we are given. The key for us and for you is that the definitions in statute be written very tightly. Those of you who paid any attention to last year's bill will remember that at one point they were amending the definition of family member to include language that was something along the lines of any individual with whom you have the intention of entering into a relationship of indefinite duration. I have no idea what they thought they meant by that. Actually, I do. They were trying to go for chosen family, but that was not the right way to get it. As a carrier, we need to know exactly who we're pricing the risk for and then how to adjudicate the claims. There's no way you can adjudicate a claim with fuzzy language like that. And of course, you as employers don't want that kind of fuzzy language either. And then because we were doing our pricing using a range of different industry sectors, we didn't have one flat rate as the task force actuary did. We had a range. But as you can see in the low benefit plan, our pricing was pretty much in the same ballpark. A little bit less in the low benefit plan, a little bit more, 689 to 811 in that low benefit plan. We were a little higher than the task force in the high benefit plan. So if you could go to the next slide, then we can talk about how this was received. And let's just say there were not a lot of people who embraced it. So as I mentioned earlier, the Family Task Force was heavily weighted toward advocates of a state-run plan. So neither the task force nor others in the advocacy community, nor the labor unions liked the idea of a private market at all. The final task force report was about 36 pages long. I think 6 of those pages were devoted to throwing rocks at the idea of a private market. The business community said, look, we don't want to have to be forced to do paid family and medical leave, period. But if there's gonna be a bill, and our political radar tells us that something's gonna pass this year, we would much prefer a private market than a state-run plan. Other insurers, as I mentioned, said, yeah, we'd love to be a part of this, although some of them would like to set it up in a way that excludes Pinnacol, and I'll talk more about that later. Legislative leadership has been very receptive to this. And again, remember that the Democrats control both chambers of the legislature, and they're looking for a win. So they were very receptive to this idea because they thought it was something that would get them across the goal line. The sponsors of last year's family bill, not so much. We have a saying in the lobby, you carry the bill, you don't marry it. They married their bill. They didn't really love our approach. Interestingly, though, the person who has been most enthusiastic about this is Governor Polis. And the thing to know about Governor Polis is that more than anything, in many ways, he's more of a libertarian than a liberal. Now, I wouldn't say he necessarily shows that when it comes to environmental regulation. But in many other things, he is a real free market guy. He's like, let the market handle it, let people compete, let businesses compete, keep the state out of the way. And starting last May, he said, I think the idea of a state-run plan is absolutely ridiculous. You need a private market approach, make it work like workers' comp. So he's been very enthusiastic about this idea from the beginning. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide, then we'll talk about how things are shaping up with the politics. So here we are in an election year, as if we didn't all know that. And the Democrats really want a win on this. They really want to protect their members who are running for re-election, who can say, look, I delivered this for you. And I made the point here about the Dems holding more cards than the Republicans, because you'll find me talking a lot about the Democrats when I talk about this bill. And it's simply because they're the ones who hold the chips on this. As I mentioned earlier, the governor does not want a state-run plan. So that has created real headwinds for the advocates of that plan. But their primary concern about a private market approach was they did not want it to be community rated. They want everybody to pay the same amount. They don't think it's fair that some industries would pay more than other industries simply based on their demographic profile. I can tell you that according to our modeling, the difference in those premiums in most cases wouldn't be huge, but it's a basic equity argument from the standpoint of the advocates. So Sarah, let's go to the next slide and talk about where things are now. Well, surprise, surprise, and lo and behold, over the weekend, the sponsors of last year's bill unveiled their principles for this year's bill, and it's not a state-run plan. It is a private market approach. And for all intents and purposes, the state plan appears to be dead at the legislature. And I think the sponsors have made a pragmatic political calculus that if they're going to get a win on this, and remember what I just said on the previous slide, the Dems really want to win on this issue this year, they're going to have to do a market-based approach. However, what they're recommending is a different approach than the one that Pinnacol put forward. Again, you'll recall that we said it should be risk-rated, and you have a carrier of last resort like Pinnacol. You have somebody there to catch all the bad risks, but that carrier and everybody else is also operating in the competitive market. The Commissioner of Insurance and the bill sponsors didn't like that idea, so they said we've got to have community rating. We have to have everybody paying the same amount. So the way we're going to get there is guaranteed issue, meaning every carrier operating in the market will have to take all comers, so you don't need a carrier of last resort. And then that community rating will be risk adjusted on the back end. And so what they mean by that is that the Commissioner of Insurance will set the premium. And then at the end of the year, if some carriers paid out more in claims than were covered by the rate, they'll be made whole. And if other carriers paid out less than was needed, they will contribute to making those other carriers whole. This is a model that is being used, again, in the individual market for health insurance. It's extremely tricky to work this out. And you can see some of the problems that we've had on the health benefits exchange in Colorado, partly related to this kind of approach. So Sarah, let's go to the next slide. So how are people reacting to these principles coming from the sponsors who, as far as I can tell, pretty much shut themselves up in a room with the insurance commissioner and worked this out? So the true believer advocates, who tend not to be pragmatic political thinkers, are not excited about this. Unions are running around like headless chickens. The other advocates they're saying, well, we like the idea that everybody pay the same amount, but we don't think it makes sense to do it in the private market. Too many people won't have access to the benefit. There will be too many restrictions. We don't trust insurers, et cetera, et cetera. And as I say here, they've got another card up their sleeve, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I mentioned that labor really doesn't like this idea of a private market, but interestingly, they are some of the folks saying that, well, if you do a private market, then we don't want Pinnacol to participate. For some reason, labor doesn't like Pinnacol. It's mostly because they don't like the workers' comp system. It's not that they don't like us. And as I have said to my colleagues from the labor unions, I don't think you would want a private market that is only out-of-state carriers and doesn't include the homegrown mutual insurer that has better satisfaction ratings for both injured workers as well as policyholders than anybody else. Just saying. So the business community is, and when I talk about the business community, I'm talking about the big groups and associations, Colorado Chamber, Denver Metro Chamber, trade associations, National Federation of Independent Business, those folks. They're saying, well, we're really glad you're moving toward a private market, but you haven't talked to us. And there's an awful lot of devils in these details. We need to be at the table with you. And then the out-of-state insurers feel like with this approach, they've come up with a model that doesn't include Pinnacol because they don't like competing with us. Sorry about the commercial, but that's just the way it is. But the thing is, there's no insurer who likes a guaranteed issue community rated risk adjusted model. So they're telling the sponsors, oh yeah, sure. And I think some of them will play. I really do. I don't think the 16 national insurers that the sponsors have said they have will actually write this product, at least not right away. If it goes forward in this fashion, I think you will initially see a market with a few carriers, and most of the rest will sit on the sidelines for a couple of years to see how it shakes out. So Sarah, let's go to the next slide, and everybody, we're nearing the end here. So as I said earlier, this is a tricky approach. It's a risky approach. We can do it. We can be a part of that market. We just need to be allowed to do so. And that requires changing Pinnacol statute. As I said earlier, labor doesn't like us, and our competitors don't really want us in the market. So changing our statute to allow us to do anything else is always tricky. But we think that everyone should welcome a homegrown mutual insurer participating in this market. Sarah, let's go ahead to the next slide now. So the wild card that the advocates have up their sleeve is what is going to make all of this very interesting over the next couple of months of the legislative session. And that's the ballot initiatives that you may have read about a couple of weeks ago. So some of the advocacy groups have filed titles for 2 different ballot initiatives, and the only reason they've done 2 is that, you know, they'll see which language gets accepted. But their idea is if the legislature either doesn't pass a family leave program this year, or more importantly, doesn't pass a state-run program this year, then they'll go to the voters. And they are counting on the fact that it's going to be a wave election with a very large liberal turnout, because the liberal base will be there for the anti-Trump vote, and that those people will cast their ballots to establish a state-run family medical leave program. So they think that they can win at the ballot box even if they lose in the legislature. I'm not convinced that they can, because most likely their ballot language is going to have to begin with the magic words, shall taxes be raised by ... And as you all know, no statewide tax increase has succeeded in Colorado since our first tobacco tax increase in 2004. That's the only one since Tabor, and nothing since. So I think this is a risky bet on the advocates' part, but at the same time, it's a very intriguing one. So I believe that's the end. Sarah, will you go to the next slide here? Because I think we're at the point to take questions. Hello?
Hey, there's one more slide that says what's next.
Oh, there's one more slide. Okay, good.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. So, all right. So I told you that the bill sponsors had released their list of principles last weekend. The word of the Capitol is that they're going to drop their bill next week. As I indicated earlier, there are a lot of folks who feel like they've been left out of conversations about what exactly is in this bill. So it would behoove the sponsors to do some stakeholder outreach before they introduce a bill, but we'll see. Now, bear in mind, we've got a little less than 3 months left of the legislative session. And the questions, the last day will be May 6th. So on one level, that's not very much time. In legislative time, that's a lot of time. So we've got just about 3 months for things to work themselves out at the legislature. And then with the ballot initiative process, so first they need to go to the title board at the Secretary of State's office and get the titles of their initiatives approved. Then they have to get the language of one or both of those initiatives approved, and that's tricky, and there will certainly be legal challenges to them because opponents will want to keep them off the ballot. But if one of those initiatives gets approved to gather signatures, then they're going to have to do that, and that is a very expensive undertaking. The advocates do have $500,000 in the bank already, which helps, but in order to pass a ballot initiative in Colorado, you need at least $1 million as a general rule of thumb. So lots more to come with the ballot initiatives, and that will be something to keep your eyes on over the spring and summer months. Okay, now we are at the end and can get to questions.
Yeah, I know a couple folks are interested if we could share these slides after.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I will send those out to everyone. Okay, one question came in. What does the legislation look like in our neighboring states?
That is an excellent question. The answer is nothing. None of our neighboring states have anything like this. There are 7, I guess now 8 states plus the District of Columbia that have state-run family and medical leave programs. They are all on the coasts. New York is the only state that has a private market component to its family medical leave requirement. They do it sort of like what we're talking about, but everybody else has a state-run plan, but nobody in the middle of the country does it. So I see a question here about where can we find the details on the weeks per reason. So first of all, until there is actually a bill introduced, none of that will be seen. What the sponsors are talking about right now is starting at 8 weeks and moving up to 12 weeks. But every proposal I have seen just has X number of weeks for family leave, X number of weeks for medical leave. They don't differentiate birth from sickness. It's just caregiving versus medical leave. But so we don't have any details. There aren't any details from the sponsors to share on that yet. But as I said, they're talking about starting at 8 weeks for each leave, and then over the next few years, increasing that. And then I see that somebody else also asked if there are any other market-based approaches in the country. And yeah, as I was saying, as you were typing that, I think, Lindsay, New York has a market-based component to its family leave plan. It's different enough from ours that it's kind of hard to compare apples to apples there, but they have a number of carriers participating in their market. So I see a question about if this would run concurrently with FMLA and not in addition to. Yeah, well, so that, as you probably know from last year's bill debate, was a big sticking point between the business community and the sponsors. The sponsors, once again, want it to be in addition to FMLA, and I anticipate that they will get a lot of pushback. And from the standpoint of insurance carriers, again, from a pure insurance management perspective, we can do whatever we are told as an employer. I have an opinion on that I expect is aligned with yours. So somebody's asking about the employee-employer split for the cost. Again, we'll see what the sponsors put in their bill. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was interesting that the Family Task Force ultimately recommended, and they recommended this unanimously, that the premium be borne entirely by the employee. I don't know where the sponsors of this year's bill are going to come down on that. In the 2 ballot initiatives that have been filed, each of them has an employer-employee split, but they're different. One is 70-30 employee-employer, and the other is, I think, 60-40. And I don't know why they bothered to shape it in that particular way. But yeah, so that's another sticking point. And I see you're also asking about the definition of family. Yet to be written, yet to be determined. From what I have seen from the bill sponsors, they want to include another very broad category in addition to parent, spouse, child. I think they've got grandparent and sibling, and parent's domestic partner, and then they're tinkering with some new language about how to deal with chosen family. I think it's still pretty inartfully done, And let me talk just a little bit about what the advocates all say about that chosen family piece. So they look at, for example, the trans kid who's been kicked out of his house, has lived on the street for a few years, has been adopted by a posse of other kids. You know, finally he's got a job, and he wants to take leave so that he can take care of the pal who took care of him when they were both living on the street. But all they are is pals. So how do you write pals who are as close as family members into legislative language? It's a tricky challenge. So we'll see how the sponsors tackle that. But that's the problem they're trying to solve with those broad definitions. And I can send to Colin and Sarah the initial principles that came from the sponsors last weekend, so you can see the direction of their thinking. I'm happy to do that. And again, let me make very clear, those are the principles coming from last year's bill sponsors, not Pinnacol, not other insurers.
Great, thanks, Edie. I will include that when I send out your slides to everyone who's on this call. And there was one other question that I was going to ask Colin to address. It was in regards to, has SHRM weighed in on any of this? And Colin, I know you can speak to that.
I thank you, Sarah. I can speak to that. Although, as Edie just got done saying, we haven't taken a position this session because we don't know what's coming at us. So you got to know first. I will tell you that last session, we took a position opposed to the bill, and we did do some writing on that, and we also went to the legislature and testified. And we're doing more and more of that these days as our advocacy program has developed. But you know, when this comes out, we're going to look at it real carefully, and we're going to think about it. The board will talk about it, and we'll decide whether to take a position. And in our view, you know, you can do three things. You can oppose, you can support, or you can take no position. And those are all equally valid conclusions, as long as you are thoughtful about it, and as long as you discuss it and the board makes a decision. So that's coming up. So I was very interested to hear that that'll be dropping, as those in the know, as Edie say it. I love the lingo and the jargon that you all use. But it's dropping next week probably. So once that happens, I and the board will get on it right away, and we'll have some discussions. We'll figure out what position to take. So I don't know, Sarah, are there any other questions here? I know we got to wrap up here fairly soon, but if there are, go ahead.
I don't see any more that have come in. Edie, I will also include your contact info for folks if they just have a question, or you're copied on the reminder email. But when I send out all the slides, if someone has a question they'd like to follow up, you can do that directly with Edie. But otherwise, Colin, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Okay.
Well, I really want to, Colin, real quick, I just want to apologize to everybody for the technical difficulties on my end, and I appreciate everyone's patience.
Well, those things happen, and no apologies necessary. You know, once you called back in, everything was great. So thank you, everybody, for hanging in there with us on that. But thank you, Edie, so much. This has been so informative and so interesting. You know, we'll continue to keep our eyes on this and keep you all posted. I do want to say that we've got our Day at the Capitol event coming up on March 25th, where we're going to be talking about this and a lot of other issues. There's a lot of issues coming down the pike here for HR people and employment lawyers. So really urge you to participate or to join us for that. I'm also very pleased to announce that we have our keynote speaker, and our keynote speaker will be Kelly Bruff, the president and CEO of the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. And I'm really thrilled to have her speaking to us, because she's a great speaker, and she's very knowledgeable about the issues that are of interest to all of us. So hope to see you all there. Edie, thanks again. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great
Thank
weekend.
you, Edie. Bye, everybody.